My name is Blaine Fable. I'm the Chancellor of the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome to Saskatoon, welcome to the University of Saskatchewan, and welcome to Treaty 6 Territory. I'd like to start this program. We have a number of speakers this morning. I think I've quietly told them I'm going to limit them to 3 or 4 minutes each for their introductory comments, so I can speak for much longer. I might shave maybe 2 minutes off of each of their times this morning, so I'm just kidding. I'd like to acknowledge before we start, just thank all of you for coming from far, far away, from coast to coast to coast. This is a national gathering of Indigenous leaders, of academics, and the purpose is to respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations for post-secondary matters. As part of our activities today, we have a number of students who will be witnesses, who will bear witnesses, some of whom are survivors of residential schools. So I'd just like to have them stand up and be acknowledged before we start our day. So students, please rise that are here. Thank you. Having Canada recognize Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge in universities is the mandate, and that's the task that's before you here today. And I was drawn as I was thinking of what to say and how to start the conference this morning. I recalled my first day of law school, actually, and in Queen's University. And those of you from Queen's, don't be offended by the story because I'm still a proud alumni. But my first day property class, the teacher started the course by saying, the Queen owns all the land of Canada. The crown and right of the Queen owns all of the land in Canada. And I was a room full of about 100 other students. It was a first-year class. And I put up my hand. I was the only Indian in the class, and I put up my hand, and I said, the teacher recognized me. And I asked her, how did the Queen get the land? And she stopped, and her name is Bev Bain. She's a wonderful professor, and she's a wonderful lady. But this is her very first, she was a young professor, this was her very first class, and I jarred her. And she got so flustered and flummoxed that she canceled the class, and she said, class is dismissed, and we'll come back tomorrow. And I got hissed by all of these other students that had paid a lot of money for tuition, and were not there for a 5-minute class. But the point of that anecdote is that ultimately, they changed the curriculum, and she started out teaching Aboriginal title. But that the legal regime, the philosophy, the history of this country is not accurate. It's not accurate because it was designed to not tell our story, to not tell the Cree story, the Blackfoot story, the Dene story, the Ojibwe story. It wasn't the Micmac story. It was designed to deprive us of our lands. It was designed to oppress us as people, and it was just racist. It was an affront to our dignity and our basic human rights. The violence that has been committed against our people is a scar that this country bears, and it's a scar that this group today will start to heal. There's violence to generations of children, to our languages, to our culture, and that change is happening now, finally and slowly. But one of the things that we need to deal with, particularly today, in terms of the fiction of this country, is to talk about the violence that residential schools exposed our people to, the harm that was caused our children, the harms that it caused our communities, and that we need to, as a country, reconcile. We need to make peace with one another. We need to make amends. In his letter from the Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King made a distinction back in those days about just and unjust laws. And I quote, "A just law is a man-made law which squares with the moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law which degrades human personality is unjust. One has a legal and moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws." One of my personal heroes, a very dear friend of mine, Phil Fontaine, had the courage to stand forward and disobey and challenge the unjust system of residential schools. I was a young lawyer when I went to my first Assembly of First Nations conference, and Phil had made this disclosure about a year ago or 6 months prior, and I remember listening to some chiefs talk about it, and their reaction was very much a product of the experiences, the shame. They said, we're not supposed to talk about that stuff. Let's not talk about that stuff. And he wasn't popular at the time for making his disclosure, but it took a lot of courage. And that those survivors that have gone forward and stood for the truth, those survivors that have challenged Canada and challenged universities to do better, are not seeking retribution. They're not seeking harm. They're not seeking any special treatment. They're just seeking reconciliation and peace. When you ask them, what do you want? They say, we want peace. And the universities are part of that healing. The universities are part of that peacemaking. And that this peace will come in many forms. It'll come in the forms of supporting our languages so our languages do not disappear from this land. It'll come from supporting our students. It'll come from working with our communities to build a better country. My Chief Poundmaker was a visionary and a peacemaker as well, and I'm proud of him because he helped broker the peace between the Blackfoot and the Crees. When we were attacked by the Canadian government in 1885, he prevented the warriors from wiping out the Canadian military as they ran back to North Battleford. And that he was a peacemaker, and that's the spirit which imbues this conference, because today, all of you gathered here are peacemakers. The peace that we need to do is to bind the harms of the past, respect our survivors, and respect the future. So let us build this peace for Canada. Let us put our minds together. This morning when we smoked the pipe, we raised it, our elder raised it to the Creator, to everybody have an open mind and an open heart to work together. And let's build this peace here today. And recall this saying that, blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Thank you. I'd now like to call on our president of the University of Saskatchewan, the co-host of this conference, Peter Stoichev, to give some opening remarks. Peter?
Thank you, Chancellor Fable. Welcome, everyone. I want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I want to acknowledge a few people who are here today, many of whom you will be hearing from. Our Elder Larry Oakes, who led the pipe ceremony this morning. Thank you very much for that, sir. Chancellor Fable, National Chief Bellegarde. Justice Sinclair, I think his plane is landing as I speak, and he'll be here at this session, I'm sure. FSIN Chief Cameron, Métis Nation President Doucette, Deputy Premier of the Northwest Territories Lafferty. It's wonderful to have all of you here. There's so many people here who have traveled from far away. I know there are people here from as far away to the east as Halifax, the West Vancouver Island, and it's wonderful to see everybody gather here today for this historic occasion. I'm really gratified by the tremendous turnout. Many others are also viewing this live streamed. This forum marks the first time in the wake of the TRC calls to action that Canadian university presidents and Aboriginal leaders will be able to sit down together to envision a way forward in building reconciliation on our campuses. And I also know it won't be the last forum of this kind, for there is a momentum building, as you all know, around creating meaningful change on campuses across Canada. Universities across the country are examining how they can make changes within the core of their institutions, engage more effectively with Indigenous communities, and become leaders and partners in building reconciliation. In fact, earlier this year, 97 members of the Universities Canada group agreed to a set of 13 principles for moving forward in enhancing educational opportunities for Indigenous students. Why here at the U of S, you may ask? First, we are a university proud to be situated on Treaty 6 territory in the Métis homeland. We have one of the highest Aboriginal student populations in the country, with almost 2,500 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students enrolled here in 2014-15, representing approximately 12% of our student body. And we are absolutely committed to strengthening our efforts across the institution to ensure the success of our Aboriginal faculty, students, and staff. Aboriginal peoples' engagement and scholarship is a signature area of our research, founded on the early work of scholars such as Jim Miller, who wrote the first history of Canada's residential schools. And why now, you might ask, and I would respond, if not now, in the wake of the TRC calls to action, when would we have a meeting like this? Reconciliation is imperative if we are to make Canada a better place for us living and working together, and to its credit, the new federal government seems to see this clearly. And what better place to address this imperative than at the country's leading cultural change institutions, the nation's universities. And I have asked, in fact, if we are going to build reconciliation, how can it possibly happen if it doesn't happen at the universities of this country? We cannot deem our role in fostering a civil society a success unless we become demonstrably and with commitment the best place we can possibly be for the Aboriginal people of this province and of this country. The TRC calls to action issue a direct challenge to us as universities, and that's what we're here to discuss today and tomorrow, with a dozen key calls to action related to our missions of teaching and learning, research and community engagement. Across Canada, fewer than 10% of Indigenous people have a university degree, and about one-third the national rate of about 27%, about one-third the national rate of about 27%. In Saskatchewan, that disparity in higher education outcomes remains one of the province's biggest challenges and a major obstacle to long-term quality of life and prosperity for all. We are committed here at the U of S, and I know at many institutions across this country, to working together with other post-secondary partners, provincially and nationally, to rebuild some of the trust that has been lost in the educational system and to advance reconciliation. This forum is intended to help set the stage for a series of U of S internal conversations around reconciliation that we are planning for 2016. We hope to develop, in consultation with Aboriginal communities, a Made in Saskatchewan blueprint for how the U of S can move forward in closing the education gap, so that this is indeed a place where Aboriginal faculty, staff, and students feel welcome and can succeed and excel. And I believe that all of you here today, like me, will learn from each other so that you can go home and strengthen your own institution's commitment to the work that lies before us. As a first step, it's my pleasure to announce on behalf of my counterparts at all 24 Saskatchewan post-secondary institutions that we have collectively made a commitment to work together on closing the education gap for Aboriginal people, a gap that, as we know, is due in large part to the residential school system and its intergenerational consequences. I am told that this is the first province-wide commitment of its kind in Canada. In a joint statement that we are issuing today on behalf of all 24 provincial institutions, we acknowledge the importance of reconciliation and go on to state, while honoring the unique missions and mandates of each of our institutions, we will seek opportunities to collaborate in consultation with Aboriginal communities to close the education gap for Aboriginal people. This is an important commitment that we wanted to make as this national forum gets underway. I am also pleased to announce that the U of S plans to partner with the National Centre on Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg, the permanent archive for all statements, documents, and other materials gathered by the TRC. And once the details of that are worked out, we plan to sign a formal agreement with the Centre in 2016. We are especially keen to identify ways to help our local communities and scholars access the Centre's vast archival resources and assist the Centre in bringing their programs to this province. In closing, it is my real hope that we will listen and learn from one another today and tomorrow, and that the respectful dialogue we are about to undertake will make a difference when we return to our home institutions. Thank you all so very much for being here today, for participating, for being committed to this, and see you throughout today and tomorrow.
Thank you, President Stoichkov. I'd like to call on our FSIN Chief, Bobby Cameron. Chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians was elected, I think, 2 weeks ago with an absolutely massive landslide almost as big as the Liberals. I'm just kidding. And, but Bobby's an alumni of University of Saskatchewan. He's a proud member of Witchican Lake Cree Nation, a traditional man, very strong support of education, and he's standing beside me, so I won't read his whole bio. Bobby?
Thank you, Blaine. Nistes. Nigan mantu kanaskuman tagagi sagaw megwats. Doucette tuarkite yak Larry. Katamskaten hipitwa tarospagan. For everyone in attendance here, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here today. Such a very important event. Reconciliation. What does it mean and where does it begin? It begins and it starts within ourselves to be able to heal and forgive, but to also plan for the future. We have drafted and put together a draft MOU based on the TRC recommendations. To my EA, Intergovernmental Affairs, Mary Culbertson, who handed it out. I'm just going to read it out because we don't have much time up here, so Blaine, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. To everyone in attendance, our National Chief, Craig Jackson, to all our presidents, I see Larry's here, Mark, Vianne, our Senator Lillian Dick, Rosalie, to Sandy Brisseth, to Cheryl Starr in the back, to everyone here, thank you all for being here. And if I forgot you, please forgive me. Winona, please forgive me. I'm just going to read this MOU. It's just in draft. A lot of good commitments verbally. We've heard the last couple of years since the TRC recommendations have first began. So here's the first kick at the can. And we at the FSIN have taken the initiative to spearhead this, to get that process started, to start implementing it in our universities, our institutions, our organizations. So here it is. It's the Memorandum of Understanding, the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report, honoring the truth, reconciling for the future. On May 31st, 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, honoring the truth, reconciling for the future. The report contained 94 recommendations to assist in moving towards reconciliation. Tens of thousands of Indigenous children were subjected to the Indian residential schools system where they endured sexual, physical, and psychological abuse, resulting in loss of language, culture, and identity. True and meaningful reconciliation is not for one side, it is not for one government, it is not for one person. It is for all sides, for all governments and institutions in this country, and for every individual. It is for all people to meaningfully listen, participate, and work together to resolve these issues. It is for the Canadian people, their leaders, and governments and institutions to reconcile through solidifying partnerships, agreements, promises, and commitments to the implementation of the Indigenous inherent and treaty rights and of true and meaningful reconciliation through hand-in-hand collaboration. Through the recognition and respect of inherent treaty and Indigenous peoples' rights, the recommendation of the TRC final report can be realized through nation-to-nation partnerships and agreements. In the spirit of this reconciliation, we, the undersigned, fully commit to immediately begin partnering with the FSIN, its member nations, and institutions, and commit to implementing the recommendations of the TRC report of 2015 with full capacity and resources to do so in schools, institutions, and organizations throughout our treaty territories, provinces, and Canada. Today, to the U of S President Peter Stoichev and your staff, and of course our Chancellor Blaine, who was also one of our Grand Chiefs of the FSIN, true partnership, true relationship, respectful communication. Now, you look at the signatories on this list, and it's going to take a whole lot of time, a whole lot of planning, and a whole lot of juggling of our schedules to make this happen. But I know in my heart and in my mind, together, we can get this job done. To our Métis President, Robert Doucette, thank you for being here. You're one of the signatories on this MOU. You know, that MOU is on your table for you to take home to your organizations, to your colleagues, for more direction, for more input, for more advice. To strengthen it as much as we can as organizations. How many minutes is that? Overtime? But please take this home. First kick at the can, the Memorandum of Understanding for the TRC final report. Let's get this job done, and let's start implementing the TRC recommendations. Exen Wagamuntik, Sami Patskawapam Tinawao, Marshi Cho, Tinige, Migwich, Washte, hi hi.
Thank you very much. I already got heck from the organizers that I missed one part of the agenda, so I'll come back to that. But I'm first going to go to my friend and also an alumni of the University of Saskatchewan, President of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, Robert Doucette. Robert has been active in Métis political life and has been employed with a variety of Métis social justice programs. He previously served as President of Saskatoon Métis Local number 126, and he's a really good friend to the University of Saskatchewan and a very good representative of his people. So come on up, Robert.
Thank you, Chancellor Favel. Well, we've come a long way from the MUB, eh?
No stories. King George?
No, we won't tell about the King George. Mum's the word. Now, that's just old alumni stories we'll just stay away from today. So, I just want to say it's my honor and pleasure to be here this morning. As I do with every speaking engagement, if you'll allow me, I want to pay recognition to my wife, Bellegarde, who actually went to Beauval Indian Residential School along with her family. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chancellor, we found an old 1967 picture of her auntie doing this quilt that's in the Human Rights Museum. It was quilted by Dene or Beauval Indian Residential, and it's a national, I guess it's a national treasure, so, you know, it was quite amazing that we just found that picture. To my kids and to my granddaughters, they're all First Nations, Long Plains Reserve, English River. And to the Creator, let us thank the Creator today for this day, for us being together to talk about reconciliation, because that's, I think, what the Creator wants. President Stoichev, thank you for hosting this. Chief Bellegarde, Chief Cameron, I want to tell you I was so happy when you were elected. First Nations people for both you are going to benefit very greatly, and I think everybody here should give them a round of applause because they're in good hands now. President Saddleback, and of course I would be remiss in recognizing some Métis dignitaries here. Helen Johnson, who is on the Provincial Métis Council, who I'm sitting beside. Our former Vice President, Murray Hamilton, who's sitting to the right of me. Former Premier, Calvert. My good friend, how are you? Haven't seen you in a while. There's just so many people that I could say hello to and recognize, but I've only got 4 minutes, and I've probably wasted 2 now. But reconciliation, I think, when I was thinking about it, real reconciliation means that the parties that are trying to reconciliate are part of the process. And as a Métis person, and as a person that has a treaty grandmother that signed treaty in August 4th, 1906 in Isle of Cross, and her children subsequently taking Métis scripts that weren't honored by the federal government, and we are now a landless people. When we look at a lot of the reports, the Métis people really have been left out, and including with this TRC report, we really weren't part of it. The day schools that we went to, that our relations went to, that my grandfather went to Beardy's, the Métis people have been left out. And that's a mark on this country that I think that has to be dealt with in a good way. Because why do we have to keep going to court to reconciliate? That's not reconciliation. And so I thought about this, and I didn't want to rain on the parade of everybody, because, these are very serious issues to Métis people. These are very serious issues to Métis people, and if we're going to live in this country, if we're going to build this country together, if we're going to live in peace, unlike other parts of the world that we see right now, we all have to be partners in reconciliation, and we all have to shake the hand and believe that we are actually reconciliating. Now, with the new election, I'm ever hopeful. With leaders like Chancellor Favel, President Stoichev, Chief Cameron, Chief Bellegarde, and others, I think the environment is conducive to that. And so, I say to you that it is my honor to stand here and welcome all of you here, and to congratulate the organizers of this event. The Métis are ready to be part of Canada. Let's build this nation and this province together. And I humbly ask the First Nations chiefs, like they did in Treaty 6, like they did in Treaty 4, to stand up for their Métis brothers and sisters. We're related to you. Our Mushums and Cookums are yours. The federal government and the provincial government listens to you. You have a lot of power. I'm looking at you, chiefs, right now and asking you to help your Métis brothers and sisters. Please. To everybody here, to all you non-Aboriginal Canadians, speak up for the Métis too. Because in a lot of instances, like Palliser and all these explorers that came out here, they got lost in the middle of the prairie, and who did they bump into? They bumped into Métis people. And of course, what did we do? We brought them in, we fed them and clothed them and gave them provisions and patted them on the back and sent them packing. Oh, that was a joke. Anyways, Chancellor Favel, thank you for this opportunity. Let's have 2 good days of discussion. It's been my honor. Marcy Chu, God bless all of you and your families. Aye.
I'd now like to draw your attention to the screens. We're going to have a welcome and comments from Minister Carolyn Bennett, who was going to be here, but some things in Ottawa kept her away as she received her mandate letters and is very busy. So I'll let the organizers of the technology play the video. There we go.
Greetings to all as you gather on the traditional territory of Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland for this important event. Ever since I heard about this event at the reception after my swearing in at Rideau Hall, I really hoped I could be there with you. Je voulais vraiment être présente avec vous, mais le temps ne me le permet pas, malheureusement. Today you will hear from National Chief Perry Bellegarde, Justice Maurice Sinclair, university representatives and others on reconciliation, one of our country's most important topics. I'm inspired and energized to see the University of Saskatchewan taking this responsibility to heart. And I think it's absolutely vital that the education sector is working with so many partners to help move the yardstick forward. As Justice Murray Sinclair said, education, or what passed for it, got us into this situation, and education is what will lead us out. But this is not just about what governments can do or about what any one sector can do. As Prime Minister Trudeau said as Liberal leader in July, reconciliation is not an Aboriginal issue. It is a Canadian issue. We all have a role to play. There's an urgent need for a renewed relationship between the federal government and Indigenous peoples in Canada, one built on trust, recognition, and respect for rights, and a commitment that the status quo must end. As the Prime Minister said, that respectful, cooperative partnership is not only possible, it is a sacred responsibility inherited from past generations and entrusted to use by future ones. Our government places an emphasis on fairness and equality of opportunity for Indigenous peoples in Canada, and there is no bigger task for me as Minister than reconciliation. In fact, I think some of you know I have named my job Minister of Reconciliation. So working collaboratively to repair the relationship between Canada and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people is job number one. Going forward in a good way means once again learning from First Peoples. That's why I'm so pleased to see that at the University of Saskatchewan, you are already running with these ideas and taking the opportunities to learn from one another. The calls to action have identified certain tasks that universities can and must take responsibility for. We're thrilled that you are doing this today. But just to let you know where I'm coming from, many years ago when I attended the University of Toronto, everyone had to swim a length of the pool to graduate. I don't think it's too much to ask that everyone graduating from a Canadian university should have some exposure to Indigenous studies. We are creating our lawyers and our doctors and our teachers. They have to know what they can do and feel their responsibility in this huge task of reconciliation. I very much look forward to hearing more from you. I wish you a very productive forum. Thank you very much. Merci, miigwech, kuyanamik.
I'd now like to call on one of our visitors from the north, Deputy Premier Jackson Lafferty, Deputy Premier of the Northwest Territories and Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, Minister responsible for Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission. Mr. Lafferty works with local Aboriginal governments, the territorial government, and with the corporate sector. Born in Bichoko, Mr. Lafferty lives in his home community until moving to Yellowknife in 2003, where he currently resides. Deputy Premier, please join us.
Morning. A question about it. So, nights and it's in the must nice. The chink at that's on nights and it's in there. Did think out a young good day. Don't have not like concert in some case. Who say good to do as it's in there on there. And what's a day? God, they so good night on there. What you must see now on there. Na head did that Tiani la. What the lot you get on there. That's why you got must nice. What is on goods in the day, go out once and a day. And that's the shit, listen down there. That's why you got must nice. I just want to say that I was one of the fortunate ones to retain my language, thanks to my parents and grandparents speaking Clinchon Dene language to me. I attended residential school as well for 4 years, so I guess I can speak from my experience as well. And I just want to say it's truly an honor to be here to witness and be present, and also to speak at this important function, Building Reconciliation Conference. These are critical discussions that we are currently having here today. As we continue to respond to the truth and reconciliation, the Commission calls for action. I just would like to acknowledge also that the historic enormous undertaking by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Justice Sinclair will be joining us shortly. Without their tireless, their passionate work, we would not be here today to discuss this very important topic. Nor would there be any attention paid to this significant time in our collective history. I'd just like to thank Chancellor Fevel for this opportunity, and also President Doucette for hosting this important presentation and gathering. You know, it's been discussed here, recognizing 24 institutions across Canada, as President alluded to, recognizing the work of TRC, the 94 recommendations are coming out. We all have a part to play. And as Métis President Robert has stated, we do need to create partnership as well. Residential schools has been a source of much of pain and loss that many generations of young Aboriginal people of the North and across Canada have experienced. But as I have said in many of TRC's event, the Gestures of Reconciliation's gathering, education is one of the pivotal roles. Places where we can reclaim the past, create strong actions of reconciliation, and where hope for the future can be found. As Justice Sinclair told audience of international teachers at a conference in Banff of last March, there can be no reconciliation without education. In addressing the TRC's call to actions, while many of the calls fall on the federal government to address, there are a number of actions already underway in the Northwest Territories. We just couldn't wait for the federal to move forward, so we decided to move forward as a territorial jurisdiction. Under action number 10, there are calls to improve education attainment levels, success rates, developing culturally appropriate curricula, and developing culturally appropriate early childhood education program for Aboriginal families. We are doing that in the Northwest Territories. Through our education renewal strategy, we're opening the door on our Education Act. We haven't explored those areas for the last 3 decades, 30 years. Through our traditional curriculum content, and through our right from the early childhood development languageness funding to licensed daycares and day homes in the Northwest Territories. Under Section Action 14, the call for preservation, revitalization, and strengthening of Aboriginal languages and cultures are best managed by Aboriginal peoples and the communities. In 2014-15, we provide funding to Aboriginal governments across the Northwest Territories to manage and steward their own language initiatives and also activities. Under Action 57, to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples. We have already begun with further training sessions for our territorial government employees. We have well over 5,600 employees that will be taking these training starting January 2016. Under Action 62, to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal people's historical and contemporary contribution to Canada, a mandatory education requirement for kindergarten to grade 12 students. We introduced a mandatory curriculum resources 3 years ago. We were the first jurisdictions to have a mandatory curriculum of its kind. In partnership with Government of Nunavut, the Legacy of Hope, this teaching resource, now in its second edition, explores many of the difficult truths of residential schools. This resource also provides students with opportunities to see where we are with these issues today and where we still need to travel on our path of reconciliation throughout Canada. The resource is built around the voices and also the experience of people who share their stories and give guidance to the educators developing the learning resources. It's the survivor stories that we must carry on. They are the teachers in the learning resource, and we thank those students, those survivors. Now many of them leaders in a wide range of fields in the north and also across Canada for the gift they have given us as materials were developed. We thank them for helping us to put events and also the effects of residential schools into proper place in Canadians' history. From now on, all people who go through our school system will know what happened and the impacts on Aboriginal people in Canada. This unit is mandatory for students to graduate in the Northwest Territories. We have also made it mandatory that every teacher in the Northwest Territories, regardless of the subject matter, undergo training in this resource. Many non-Aboriginal teachers have said that it has profoundly changed their perspectives on the part of our country's history. In my work as for the Council of Ministers of Education across Canada, as co-chair of Aboriginal Education File, the importance of teachers versed in this history is one of the subjects we explored this past June when the NWT hosted the annual Council of Ministers of Education meeting in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Simultaneously, we held Aboriginal Education Symposium with Aboriginal educators across Canada, where we asked delegates how to better support Aboriginal educators in their line of work, encourage more young Aboriginal people to choose teaching as a career. Research has shown us that hiring Aboriginal teachers from the same communities, same region, or those who share the same culture and traditions as their students enriches the learning and produces positive results for Aboriginal students. CMAC, Council of Ministers of Education, is responsible for Action 63, a call for a K-12 curriculum and the learning resources on Aboriginal people in Canadian history, the history and the legacy of residential schools, for sharing information, best practices on teaching curriculum related to residential school and Aboriginal history, building student capacity for international curriculum, understanding, empathy, and mutual respect, and identifying teacher training needs related to the above. This work is already underway through the 2015-17 CMAC Aboriginal Education Plan. As you may have guessed, this work is already a priority across the North, but more and more we are seeing jurisdictions across Canada taking on these initiatives. There are vibrant and comprehensive resources across Canada also providing content, direction, and tools to implement into education, programming at all levels, early childhood, K-12, post-secondary. I mentioned our collective history earlier, 150 years of residential school in Canada. It's not only Aboriginal history, but very much a Canadian history, as TRC Commissioner Marie Wilson has said. The history is ours to acknowledge, ours to manage, ours to reconcile. As we move forward as a nation, there have been and will continue to be challenges, but there will be also opportunities for us to move forward. There will also be successes. These successes will compound to create understanding and positive steps on the path that we travel together, a new journey. I'd just like to say thank you to each and every one of you for participating for our next 2 days. I look forward to these type of discussions it is imperative that all Canadians understand the generations of impacts of residential schools across Canada, as well as victories we have seen through much of the TRC's work. So I'd just like to say best wishes for a productive conference. Masicho.
I'd like to call on our president of the USSU, Jack Saddleback, to come provide some greetings. Jack, come on up. Jack's from the Samson Cree Nation in Musqueam, Alberta. He's a member of the U of S Board of Governors, a student here, and is actually the third in a row USSU president who is Indigenous. So very proud of that. So Jack, welcome.
Thank you. It's a beautiful day out there, eh? I'm very humbled to be here to speak on behalf of students here at the U of S and across Canada. And as an Aboriginal student leader, this particular forum is very near and dear to my heart. So when I think of this forum, I think of the 7-generation teachings that I have grown up with. The same teachings that teach each new generation as being responsible in ensuring the survival of the 7 generations to come. My ancestors from 7 generations ago had hopes and dreams for us. They had a great love for us and for the world. The same love that they had for the same people that were standing around them and the same air that they breathed that day. Those same 7 generations of Aboriginal people went through residential schools, discriminatory systems, and a larger suppressive society. These created barriers, internal and external, to their own success. I know universities can play a vital role for us to begin breaking down those barriers today. Our ancestors from 7 generations ago knew that education was our new buffalo. The same buffalo that would teach us, feed us, clothe us, and house us, like it always has been. I imagine this forum to address the issues and barriers of the access to that buffalo, because Indigenous youth and students should see themselves in post-secondary education institutions. I'm a fortunate man, though, in that I was able to see myself here at the U of S. My father, who came here to the university, Roy Saddleback, was elected as the very first Indigenous representative student member of University Students' Council with the USSU, and now myself as the current president and third consecutive Aboriginal identified president and first transgendered president. I can see myself here and hopefully inspire many more to see themselves here like my father did to me. The journey here for myself and countless others is not for one person to claim alone, however. It is a community of people who believe in one another, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike. The time is right, the place is right, for us to indigenize our institutions. We want Aboriginal students to see themselves here in these institutions, and we challenge other student unions across Canada to become strong allies for students. One of the ways that we here at the U of S, as student leaders, will be advocating for our own institution to welcome those students and create an ongoing feeling of welcome, is that we will be asking our university to erect a plaque in our Nobel Plaza, the same place where the spirit of our institution lives, a plaque that will state that this is Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. I'd like to leave you with one thought, though. Reconciliation just isn't about Aboriginal people. It's about changing our society. And when you give an Aboriginal student a chance, you give our global society a better chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'd like now to introduce our national chief. For those of you from Saskatchewan, he needs very little introduction. But for those of you from afar, Perry is from the Little Black Bear First Nation Treaty 4 territory. He's passionate about making measurable progress on the issues that matter to First Nations people. National Chief Bellegarde is a strong advocate for implementation of inherent and Aboriginal treaty rights. Widely known as a consensus builder. He's got a great track record of accomplishment. Very proud of him. He's a traditional man as well. Goes to the same ceremonies, and very proud of him. And happy that he's supporting us today. So Perry, come on up and bring your remarks. And see, he's that eager, right? He's falling over himself. Just one more thing. When we envisioned this gathering, it was to co-host it with Perry, and to make sure that this agenda item did not leave the stage and that the support did not fall off the table. So I'm happy you could make it. And Perry, please give us your remarks.
Okay. Thanks, Blade. One more thing. And then ask one. Kakiao no dentik no ako maganak. Ninaskum tino kakiao. Ni stays kitek. Larry, thank you so much for raising the pipe this morning. That's awesome. It's always good to begin in that way. And iskoyak napeak kakiao, the men, the women that are here, thank you for coming. A little bit in Cree, but as well Nakota as well. Homatakia pinamaya. A little bit of Nakota back home on Little Black Bear as well. And to Robert, there's some Métis there as well. So your pleas and your asks to work together for the Métis people as well. We recognize that. I'm going to come to a quote from Treaty 4 that's very powerful that we use back home. To all the guests that are here, right from across Turtle Island, thank you for coming. And we always acknowledge our kind, loving Creator and give thanks for this beautiful day, and that's what happened. There's too many people to recognize here because you're all important. Yeah, so if I start, I'll be here for the next hour. But I just want to thank you all because you're taking the time and energy to be here to talk about a very important topic about reconciliation and how can universities work at it. What can be done internally within your institution, whether you're in the east side of Canada, the north side, the west side, or the south side. Like, what can be done to bring about reconciliation? I do want to acknowledge, though, as well, the work of Peter, the U of S president here, Peter Stoichev, and of course, Chancellor Blaine. It's almost like we were just talking about this yesterday. It's come so fast when we started talking about this forum and gathering here a couple of months back. And I'm glad to see it's here. But with respect as well, we always acknowledge the Treaty 6 territory, and we acknowledge the Métis homeland, and Robert Doucette, the president, and the new chief, the FSIN chief, Bobby Cameron, is here, and my colleague as well from Treaty 6 territory on that side over there, Greg Mackinac. We point with our lips. He's kind of on the west side of Treaty 6 from Musqueam Cree. So he's here as well. So I wanted to acknowledge them. And we always acknowledge as well, you know, in a lot of our ceremonies, half male, half female, and we always talk about the strength of partnerships. So I also want to acknowledge my partner for being here, Val Galley. She's always the balance, and let me tell you, she balances me in a good way. So colleagues and friends, this morning, things that we're here to talk about, the TRC. And I know universities across Canada, and I'll name them, have been doing things for 20, 30, 40 years. You know, and I think of the University of Regina and what they've done in 1976 with the partnership for the, at that time, Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, now the First Nations University of Canada. University of British Columbia, University of Manitoba, Trent, Laurentian, Lakehead, University of Toronto, Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier, Guelph, Dalhousie, University of Alberta, University of Northern British Columbia, University of Victoria, have all been doing things in some way, shape, or form to try to make Indigenous students, Aboriginal students successful, and to try to do things in a more effective way to breed success. But as National Chief, I'm going to ask you to do more. I'm going to ask you to do more today. Because if we're, to bring about a reconciliation in Canada, we can't just rely on provincial governments or federal governments. We have to rely on universities, techno-vocational schools, everybody in Canada working together to close the gap that exists. And as Indigenous peoples, I say it's 6 versus 63rd, and I use this number a lot. And some background to this number. Canada is a beautiful, beautiful country. It is the best country in the world. And it's rated 6th in terms of the United Nations Human Development Index in terms of quality of life. So it's up here. Fantastic. But when you apply the same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. So it's 6 versus 63rd. That's what we need to address. Because this gap represents everything we continually talk about. It represents the cap on post-secondary education. There's 10,000 students on the post-secondary student wait list. It represents the disproportionate funding in terms of on-reserve tuition for schools on reserve. It's $6,000 per child on reserve versus the provincial system where it's almost double that at $11,000, $12,000 versus the French school system where it's almost $20,000 per child. So it represents the 132 communities with boil water advisories. That gap represents the high youth suicide rate amongst our young people. It represents, we're 4.3% of the population in Canada, but 25% of the jails are filled by our people. It represents the overcrowded housing. It represents all those negative statistics, the high rates of TB coming back, the diabetes, all these negative things. And yes, it represents the violence amongst our communities and the 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents all those negative things, 6th versus 63rd. So to close the gap, to bring about reconciliation, and the gap, just simply put, that gap is there because of two things, and we know what those two things are. The imposition of the residential schools and the imposition of the Indian Act in 1876. Between those two things, you can attest to why it's this gap that exists. And so what do we do now? And so we lift up the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission members, Justice Sinclair, Willie and Marie, for the work they've done. And they've come out with these 94 recommendations. And when they released that report in this past summer, and it's an interim report, the final report will be coming out December 15th, the final report. There is this great big gathering in Ottawa. The interim report's done. And the biggest thing was, what does it mean? What does it look like, reconciliation? And I asked people, for me, it's almost like if we can ask the people of Canada to make space in their minds and their hearts and their spirits, and to get rid of misconceptions about Indigenous peoples, and make space for new things to come in. The things that I was referring to, the misconceptions you have about Indigenous peoples, the stereotypes, the dumb, stupid, lazy, drunk welfare, the pagan, the savages, all these things that have been taught throughout the years. Make space, make room, put those to the side so new things can come in. The acceptance of our different diversity in our languages and our contributions to Canada. Then you can start having a dialogue about reconciliation. Make space and make room. In this job I have as National Chief, and it's almost a year, December 10, in Winnipeg. And then I've had the great opportunity to go across Canada and talk to people and to try to deal with people and to bring about this change and reconciliation in Canada, dealing with the premiers, Council of the Federation. We've met once. We're gearing up for the next round. And I want to talk about that piece first, and I also want to talk about the federal piece, and then bring it back to where it's not just federal, provincial governments, but universities as well can do things. So in our dialogue with the provinces, the premiers, there's certain things and challenges I asked of them as well. Certain things I wanted them to do, which they can do. Build upon the good work. Premier Brad Wall, build upon the good work of Premier Calvert. Where's Lauren? I saw him here earlier. Need a hand. There he is. Build upon. And the first thing I said was, premiers, you must establish a bilateral relationship with Indigenous leaders and chiefs in your territories. Whether you call it a Tier 1, Tier 2 process, whether you call it a bilateral agreement, but have access where the chiefs and the leadership can have access to the premiers and the cabinet on a regular basis. It's all about dialogue. It's all about access. It's all about finding common ground. So do that. And once you do that, start talking about the educational system and changes to the curriculum. Change the curriculum. In Saskatchewan, it has led the way. We're all treaty people. That theme, that word is going right across Canada because we're all treaty people. Change the curriculum, so K to 12. Those curriculums that are there have to teach treaties, have to teach about the history of treaty and Indigenous rights and Aboriginal rights and the Métis rights, Métis title. All those things have to be taught in the school systems. Because everywhere you go, you talk to people, oh, I didn't know about treaty. I learned about the Treaty of Paris, the Treaty of Ghent, the Treaty of Versailles, all these things, but I didn't learn about Treaty 6. I didn't learn about Treaty 4. In that line in Treaty 4 for our Métis brothers, when Alexander Morris came out to meet with Chief Little Black Bear and Kakishweo and Paipod, the chiefs asked the commissioner, what about our Métis brothers? Alexander Morris's words were these: Chiefs, we'll treat and make treaty with you first. Then we'll come back to the Métis brothers and sisters. We'll treat with you first. But to this day, they have not come back. So we can, Robert, I see you nodding, we're gonna, we'll help, we'll push for that, okay? Because that's, again, I get all emotional. But that's something, that's the work that we have to do. So in Treaty 4, Treaty 6, we even have in Canada, I was just on the East Coast, with the Mi'kmaq people, the Maliseet people, Pasquamawati peoples, but they have pre-Confederation treaties, peace and friendship treaties. So they need to learn about that in that territory. You also have the Robinson Superior treaties, Robinson Huron treaties. And everybody thinks in British Columbia there are no treaties, but you have the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island. And then we even have treaties amongst ourselves as Indigenous peoples. The treaty between the Cree and the Blackfoot. Very important. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. And so when you have that right, you can make treaties with the Crown and as well amongst ourselves. Our own land, our own laws, our own languages, our own people, our own identifiable forms of government. And so we have that ability. And so changing the curriculum is very fundamental and key to bring about reconciliation in Canada. Teaching treaties. And as well, the residential schools have to be taught. The residential schools have to be taught, and the impacts of the residential schools have to be taught. So you see that big push, that big movement. So requests to the premiers, the bilateral, changes to the curriculums, right across Canada, K to 12, but as well, languages. And I lift up the Northwest Territories, because what you've done in there, Deputy Premier Lafferty, in terms of recognition of the 11 Indigenous languages in Northwest Territories are recognized as official languages of the territory. Fantastic. That's fantastic. So again, the request to the premiers. Why can't that happen in Saskatchewan? Why can't that happen in Nova Scotia? Why can't that happen in Alberta and BC? So the requests to the premiers. The languages are key. The other requests, because of the Chilcotin case, the Williams case, you want economic certainty. We all want economic certainty, economic stability, creating a greater boom with the economy. Then you must find a way to deal with free, prior, and informed consent, which is in the UN Declaration. You must find a way to deal with duty to consult and accommodate. And yes, start talking about revenue sharing. Because based on treaty, we didn't give up everything. We said we'd share. We would share the land and resource wealth so that everybody could benefit from this great country and the resource wealth that's here. We'd share. So having those things in place, and it's a difficult dialogue, but it really helps when you start looking out across Canada to close this gap. So each of those things that I mentioned, from the bilateral, the curriculum changes, the treaties, the residential schools, the recognition of languages as official languages, to finding tables and processes to deal with revenue sharing, to deal with free, prior, informed consent, to even this policy change. This was my last request to the premiers, that before they issue a license or permit to any industry operating within their provincial boundaries, any industry operating, before they issue a license or permit, that company, that industry must demonstrate that they have a strategy and plan to deal with procurement for First Nations businesses, to deal with a representative workforce strategy in place, and to even look at benefit sharing as well. And if they do not have a strategy in place, do not issue a license or permit. Boy, you'll see those industries start developing things pretty quick. And even you see that happening in Saskatchewan when BHP has come into the province. Before it used to be Agrium, PCS, and the other companies that have been operating for years here, the big three. Well, when BHP Potash came in, boy, all of a sudden you see, we got a VP of Aboriginal Affairs over here now. We got more Indians on the board over here now. And that's a good thing. Because I've always said, we need to get more and more First Nations people around decision-making tables. Wherever policies and our legislation, our strategies are being developed, you need to create space, and you need to have people of diverse backgrounds around those decision-making tables. And I'll lift up Prime Minister Trudeau, because we've got two around that table now. Jody Wilson-Raybould, first ever woman, First Nation woman, former regional chief from BC, Solicitor General of Canada. That's fantastic. Hunter Tutu, I like his name, Hunter. He's in charge of fisheries now. But he's there. And I'm really glad that Minister Jody wasn't put in Indian Affairs, Indigenous Affairs. Because I've said it publicly, we don't need to be pigeonholed as Indigenous peoples. You know, just put the Indian in Indian stuff. No, we've got skills in all areas. We've got First Nations business leaders, First Nations scientists, First Nations astronomers, First Nations in every sector that are strong on the economy, strong on the environment, strong on justice, strong on international affairs. And we can do a job, and it's value added. And that's the challenge to university presidents, is that when an Indigenous person becomes a faculty member or becomes a director or whatever, they're value added. Because not only do they have their master's and their doctorate degrees, they bring that value added element of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous worldview, and that's value added. So those are things to the provinces. Now to the federal government. The federal government, in terms of closing the gap. And we needed to strengthen First Nations families and communities. It was one of the first themes we've asked for, which means, yes, the inquiry, but investments in education and training, investments in wellness centers, investments in water and housing, all those things. Strengthening Indigenous families and communities. Then we've asked for, secondly, is to find a proper fiscal framework with the Crown. A proper fiscal framework. Because this 2% funding cap has been in place for 20 years for Indigenous people, chiefs and councils. It's a cap on opportunity. It's a cap on growth. It's a cap on potential. Especially when, across Canada, the fastest growing segment of Canada's population are young First Nations men and women. And so if you do not start investing in human capital, the status quo is maintained. That 6 versus 60-30 is maintained. And that's not in the best interest of our people or of Canada. So that gap's got to close. And so investments in a proper fiscal framework, establishing a proper fiscal framework with the Crown. Then we talked about rights. And all these things, why I'm listing these things, because you're all involved in research. And we're going to need your help in areas of research, and I'm going to come back to that. So these themes that I'm saying, I'm going to come back and ask you, what would a treaty implementation framework look like now in 2015 and beyond? What would a national treaty commissioner look like as becoming a formal institution of government? Because the third theme we asked the Crown to look at was a rights framework, a rights agenda, to start respecting inherent rights and treaty rights and Aboriginal rights and title. And so if Canada was founded utilizing this office called a treaty commissioner, where is that now? We have a regional treaty commissioner here. We have a regional treaty commissioner in Manitoba. But their authority in terms of reference and mandate It's not the same as Alexander Morris's authority reference mandate. So in Canada, as institutions of the Crown, institution of government, we have Privy Council Office, we have Prime Minister's Office. So we have PMO, PCO. Where's our TCO? Treaty Commissioner's Office. What would that look like? What would that be? How would that be structured? As a machinery of government, as an office of government. You know, so some work that can be embarked on that. So that was the rights piece. And the importance and the relevancy as well of 2017 is coming into play. 2017. The 150th birthday of Canada. So what will happen that year? What will the birthday celebration look like? How will Indigenous peoples be involved? What will we be celebrating? The 6th versus 63rd? What will we be celebrating? Colonization? Are we going to be celebrating reconciliation? We're going to be celebrating that we're still here as Denisant-Lénaire peoples, Nehewak peoples, Anishinaabe peoples, the Mi'kmaq peoples, because we have 58 different Indigenous languages here in Canada. And that's why there's a dialogue and there's a theme starting to happen across Canada to break down that misconception that this beautiful, great country was founded on 2 founding nations, just English and French. And English is a beautiful language. French is a beautiful language. Mais oui, mes amis, je parle français un petit peu. Tu es très important dans mes yeux. Oui. I said, you're all important in my eyes. But as well, the 58 different Indigenous languages right across Canada. That was the other bullet. How do we revitalize the Indigenous languages of Canada? How do we breathe life into them where there's a fluency amongst our peoples again? And that thought has always been, if the governments would apply as much resources in revitalizing the languages as they spent through the residential schools trying to kill the languages, what would that look like? How would we move ahead? So the importance of languages, because this is important as well. And studies have shown that once a young person is fluent in their language, they're more successful in school because they know who they are and they know where they come from. And that's very important. So even that in itself is an investment in closing the gap. So from languages to strengthening families and communities, to the rights agenda, to even the implementation strategy and plan now for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Putting in place a TRC strategy and action plan. And that's what this is. We don't want the TRC recommendations to fall the way of the RCAP report. Remember the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples? Big, long study, hundreds of recommendations, not really many being implemented. So it's important now that we have the operative word in place, implementation strategy. And this is where the universities come in now. The universities. Now, it's not just governments that have a role to play. University presidents and your management teams and your board of directors all have budgets. All can make decisions. Funding universities and other bodies that fund academic research can influence the speed and effectiveness of meeting the reconciliation challenge in their decision-making. That's true. I understand that the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada has been examining its role in working with Indigenous peoples, academics, experts, and knowledge holders. Their work to promote a respectful knowledge, opportunities, and change in academia includes creating strong research partnerships with Indigenous communities through appropriate research protocols, supporting research about Indigenous systems of knowledge, and making strategic investments in Indigenous-focused research. Now here, each university, each faculty, each degree program, and each research and professional association has opportunities right now to promote and achieve career opportunities for Indigenous scholars, and just as importantly, an environment in which they can thrive. Getting Indigenous peoples into university is one step. Are they staying? Is the environment friendly? Is it open? Is it welcoming? Is it accepting? Can you do smudge ceremonies? The importance of that. What does that mean? Why is that relevant? You got to understand all of that. Respecting and have the respect for Indigenous knowledge and traditions. Research that benefits Indigenous peoples. Indigenous control over intellectual and cultural property. Credits in Indigenous studies as mandatory requirements in all faculties. That's a big one. That can happen. Even the Minister of Indigenous Affairs said that, eh? I don't know if she got that, but I winked at her when she said that. And revitalizing Indigenous languages towards fluency. Now, this is just some of the things. I've also talked about those 6 points about closing the gap. The models for a new fiscal framework, models for resource revenue sharing. I'll lift up Ken Coates. I don't know if he's here or not, but he's starting to lay the groundwork a lot of times. You know, the academic research about, it makes sense now to start talking about this. And once academics start putting that groundwork down, it's putting in paper, that helps form the policymakers' thoughts, you know. So that's where you come in big time as researchers and academics, you know, laying, what can that look like? That resource revenue sharing model, what could it look like? Because it was always depth of a plow is all we were taught as Indigenous peoples. Models for treaty implementation, and this is my last point here, that where we need help on, the research. And it ties in what Blaine was talking about early on in his comment when he went to Queen's. How did the Queen or the Crown gain title to the land and territory? Referring to the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is something that is very important, that needs to be researched, reviewed, and challenged, because we view it as a racist doctrine. We view it like that. That's one of the reasons why I'm trying to get an audience with Pope Francis, to have him decree that. We want an audience with the Pope because two things. We want a formal apology from the Catholic Church for their role with the implementation of the residential school plan. They're the only church that do not formally apologize. That's one reason. The other reason is to get him to repeal those papal bulls, that doctrine of discovery. And now that doesn't mean that everything in Canada is going to change once that happens. But let me tell you, it will have an impact on the comprehensive claims policy. It will have an impact on the specific claims policy. And will have an impact on the inherent right to self-government policy that they have in Ottawa. Because it's all founded on termination of rights, not recognition of rights and title. So there's a whole research component that has to happen. So colleagues and friends and relatives, from our AFN to the University of Saskatchewan, we lift you up for hosting this conference here. Reconciliation is really, yes, it started, but there's so much more work to get done, so much more things that can happen. And universities have a huge role to play, a huge role to play. I'll lift up the U of S and the leadership here, because I think of the U of S and I think back, you know, they had the ITEP program, and young Max Fine works with me now, and he's one of the presidents of the Students' Union here. But he used to say, those ITEPers, boy, they sure know how to work, but they sure know how to party, he used to say. The ITEP program, that's what he used to say. But you had the ITEP program. Then you also have the Native Law Center here. Then now you have a program in theater. And now you also have a language certificate in Cree and Michif being worked on. And that'll be expanding, from what I understand, to Dakota and Dene. So the work's starting. So I lift up the U of S. I'm going to also lift up the U of S for something that's happening, and why I wanted to be here was the opening of the Gordon Oaks Student Center. How many years? Forever. It took a long time, but I wanted to be here for that. One of our strong leaders, our strong advocates for education was Leigh Gordon, our dad, Larry's dad, and my dad, and our Sundance chief, our Sundance leader. There's ceremonies at Niikanit for everything. Out of all the reserves in Saskatchewan, Niikanit has held on to their languages and their ceremonies in a very special way. You know, and it's one of the reserves that are doing great things by preserving that for our people. And to have a main building on campus named after, just, Yeah, yeah. No, we're just talking. There was no residential schools. The people didn't go. They held on their ways. But I wanted to be here for that. So that's really a big reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, National Chief. Well done. I'd like to just take a moment to pause before we hear from Justice Marie Sinclair, the chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He arrived this morning, so thank you very much, Marie, and look forward to your remarks in a couple minutes. Just a couple notes just for people in the audience to get a sense of the audience today. There's 50 universities, post-secondary institutions here in attendance today, and 20 Aboriginal organizations. From coast to coast to coast, President Florzone from Dalhousie. I see Chief Mackinac from Assembly First Nations Alberta here, many other dignitaries, so thank you so much for being here. During my opening comments or afterwards, I talked to somebody, and so non-Native people have some apprehension sometimes. I think when they come to Aboriginal issues, when they come to treaties, they feel, I don't know if they feel guilty or they don't know much or they don't know enough. That's part of what reconciliation is about. But it's nothing to be feared or bothered about because we don't all have that same knowledge. And I remember one conference I went to, I participated in at the FSIN was a health conference. It was a treaty right to education health conference because the medicine chest clause is in the treaties. And the speakers were going on about treaties, and they're talking about the importance of it and what it meant from health implications in a contemporary society. And one of our friends there in the room was getting really upset. He was getting really agitated, and he was starting to fiddle a bit. He was sitting beside my brother Alphonse Bird, and the former FSIN chief as well. And he's getting really angry, and he finally just jumped up and he said, and he put up his hand, it was a form like this, he says, "This is not right. I don't agree with what you're saying about our treaties." He said, "Our treaties are not secret. Everybody should know about our treaties." And Alphonse had to whisper over to him, because he didn't speak English very well. He said, they're not saying they're secret, he said. They're saying they're sacred. So this guy got really embarrassed, and he left the room and he went back to L'Orange. Wonderful guy, but you gotta respect that passion. And somebody else who carries himself with passion needs no introduction here. Very grateful that he could come. He's got a very busy schedule. He's done wonderful service for our people from coast to coast. We all owe him as Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, a real debt of gratitude. So from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sure from all of yours, please welcome to the podium Chief Justice Marie Sinclair.
Thank you for that very warm introduction, and thank you all for your reception. I get various kinds of introductions and receptions depending on where I go, and I was once introduced in 7 words. Actually, he only needed 3, but he used 7. It was a survivor gathering, and the people were standing and milling around and talking and making noise, and the survivor who was chairing the event was trying to get them all to pay attention and to allow me to start speaking. And so he stood up, and finally on the mic he said, "Shut up. Sit down. Here he is." So I guess I really didn't need an introduction. But I do want to thank all of you for inviting me to be here. It was not originally part of my travel agenda to be here. I was coming to Saskatoon, though, for this other conference that's going on this afternoon, when Big Bird, where is the bugger? There he is, okay. Big Bird ran into me in the airport as he was on his way to Brazil. I never get to go out of the country. I only get to go to Cambridge Bay and Inuvik. All these other guys get to travel all over the world. So he said, "You know, we're having this small little gathering."
university is having a small little consultation gathering in Saskatoon the same day you're there. He said, can you just stop by to say hello? And I said, sure, I think I can probably do it. And next thing I know, I'm being invited to attend a gathering of all of the university leaders across the country. So I appreciate, though, that this is a very significant gathering. It is the first major gathering of post-secondary educators and institutions across the nation. And your topic specifically is about looking at the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and figuring out a way that they impact the work that you're doing. And that's good. So even though as I was getting up at 4 o'clock this morning to go and catch my plane, I was saying that damn Big Bird did it to me again. Because this is not the first time he's done that. Sucked me in and said, it's just a small little gathering, Mayor, don't worry. But I see, and I knew coming in from the discussion we had with Patty and others from the organizing committee of what it was you're trying to achieve and what you're going to do with your discussions. And so I knew I had to be here, and I knew that we had to have a presence to talk to you about what it was that has gone into the thinking of the commission. So I appreciate the fact that you made time on the agenda, although I'm very aware of one important thing, and that is that I'm all that stands between you and your first bathroom break of the morning. So that's a bit of a challenge to hold your attention while you're sitting and squirming against your bladder. And your need for caffeine, right? And some of you need to go outside and smudge too, I know that. So in the few minutes that I have been asked to spend with you and talk about this, I always wonder what is it that would have some impact on the audience that I'm addressing. But I was looking at your agenda, and I was looking at the content, and I was looking at the people who are here, and you're well on the way to formulating a general action plan for yourselves. And so there's kind of little I can say about what direction you need to go, because you've already picked the direction. You've already got your guideposts. You've got your thought leaders. You've got people in the room who are very experienced with the history of residential schools and the history of the relationship between governments, institutions, and Indigenous people, and who are committed to making things better. So you have a lot of the resources that you will need as you go along on this road. So as your head cheerleader this morning, I will say this much, and that is, learn to make this work. Learn to keep doing this, because this now is an ongoing commitment that you have to hold to. You have to keep this up. Whatever it is that comes out of this day, don't let it be the end of the discussion. Don't let it be the only objective of this process, because you're going to have to get together again and again and again. Because the one thing that you always need to remember is that when you look around us and you see the condition of Indigenous people, and you look at the child welfare statistics, which are horrendous, and the incarceration rates, which are terrible, and you look at the poverty, and you look at the infrastructure challenges that every First Nation in this country faces, and you look at the condition of some of our communities in terms of chaotic leadership and loss of direction. You look at the loss of language, the loss of culture. You look at the suicide rates among our young people. You look at the drug and alcohol addiction rates. You look at the problems that our young people are having in school, so that they still continue to drop out and leave school at much higher rates than the non-Indigenous population. When you look at all of those things, you tend to be a little overwhelmed that maybe we really can't do much about that. Maybe we just need to make it look better, change the way we gather data, which is what the federal government tried to do. That we stop looking at the numbers, we stop looking at the data, so that we couldn't be held to account publicly and internationally for what was going on. And we can't do that. We have to, every morning, stare at the situation we've got and pick a small part of it that you can deal with on that day and make it work. I have been to, since the release of the summary report in June of this year, I have been to about 78 or 79 different gatherings across the country. Air Canada is very happy with me, incidentally, at doing so much traveling. Although it did knock me down for a bit, and I had to stop traveling for a little while on doctor's orders. But the reality is that the movement to reconciliation, the movement for reconciliation, is a very strong movement now. At the time that we released our report, you may remember that in the press conference that was held in front of everybody and was broadcast on the web, I was asked the question, what do you think this government is going to do about this report? And I said, we didn't write this report for this government. We wrote this report for whichever government comes along that is prepared to pick it up and work with it, because that's what it will take. It takes strong commitment. And I have the feeling that we have that government now. It would appear to me that they are making a strong commitment to the work that we have identified. But at the same time, you need to understand, and the government needs to understand, they can't do it all. And they shouldn't try to do it all. They tried to do it all back in 1874. And as a result, we have the Indian Act that's still hanging around here. We need to begin by getting rid of that and figuring out now what kind of legislation can we put in place that controls the government. We don't need a law that controls Indians. We need a law that controls the government when it comes to Indians. And that's really the thinking that needs to go into the question of reconciliation. How do we change the behavior that has contributed to the situation that we have today? One of the big questions, of course, that people are always faced with eventually, and you will today if you haven't resolved it for yourselves by now, and is the question of what is reconciliation. Those of you who look at the question carefully will realize that it has a number of possible meanings, and those of you who speak your traditional languages will know that in each language it can have a number of different words depending on the context of the issue that you're talking about. To an accountant, reconciliation is just about making sure that the column on the right matches the column on the left at the end of the day. And to a lawyer, it's all about, am I going through this divorce court process with you or not? But it's a contextual thing. And I know that in our discussions with the parties to the settlement agreement, and particularly with survivors, when we ask them, what does reconciliation mean to you? Many survivors said that they had no interest in reconciling with the government, and no interest in reconciling with the churches. I had one of the survivors, in fact, say to us, I don't know how you reconcile with the government. I don't know how you reconcile with the church. He said, it's like trying to reconcile with the car that runs you down. It's not the car that you need to reconcile with. It's the person who's driving the car. And the people who controlled those governments and controlled those churches at the time that they did all of these things, they're no longer here. But the people who are in control of those cars now are still driving them the same way. So we need to talk to them about changing the way they drive their cars. Kind of keeps it simple. It's easily understandable that way. So we need to figure out what is the behavior that has contributed to this situation that we have, and how do we change that behavior. It is very similar to a situation of family violence, coming out of a bad relationship between members of the family, where now we have confronted the abuser, and we have gotten the abuser to apologize. We have gotten the abuser to admit that he did wrong. that he was not right when he abused us. But we haven't yet seen a change in behavior on their part. An abuser who only apologizes and acknowledges past wrong is not contributing to a healthy relationship. An abuser needs to change the way they think about that relationship, and they need to change the way they behave in that relationship. I had the honor on the weekend, while I was out of town again, in Ottawa, to receive an honorary degree from Carleton University. And in my address to the convocation, to the graduates who were there, I said that reconciliation is not as complicated as we make it. It's like the treaty relationship, really, is not as complicated as we tend to make it. The problem with reconciliation and treaty relationship definitions is we often leave them in the hands of lawyers to answer. Lawyers are the worst people to try to define things. We can write books about definitions of words. But the treaty relationship and reconciliation are really about relationships. And that means that when you look at the question of reconciliation, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? And what I said to those graduates is, it's as simple as this. I want to be your friend, and I want you to be mine. When our ancestors were negotiating the treaties, that's what they were trying to achieve, is we were trying to achieve a relationship based on friendship and trust. We didn't need to talk about limiting the government interference with self-government. We didn't need to talk about crown title to the land and whether or not they were ever going to get it, because that had already been dealt with in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. I did a paper one time and delivered it on the anniversary of the Royal Proclamation in 2013, and I said why I hate the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and why I love it. I hate it because it assumes crown sovereignty, underlies Indian title, and that Indians can only transfer land to the crown. That's the worst part of the Royal Proclamation. But what it also says is that the crown promises never to interfere with the lands of the Indian nations and never to interfere with the way that the Indian nations do their own business. Those are very clear promises in the Royal Proclamation. And I know that there are some who say, yes, but it was just a crown declaration and that the Indians never really accepted it or agreed to it, but that's not true. Because the governor, who was responsible for crown relations in North America in 1764, called all of the Indian leaders together that he could get a message to and invited them to a gathering at Fort Niagara in 1764. And about 3,800 Indigenous leaders showed up at that gathering. And he had the Royal Proclamation explained to them in their language. And then he invited them to understand and accept the terms. And they exchanged those mutual promises, evidenced by wampum belts and other objects to secure the crown commitment that they needed in order to be able to move forward as a crown presence in this territory. So that promise of not interfering with the internal operations of the people was already known because those stories and that information had been passed from generation to generation. When you look at the treaties, they look like land transfer agreements. And from the Indigenous perspective, that was all that was really intended, was a land sharing agreement in which we allow you to share the land with us, and in return for which certain promises are made on the other side. But the relationship that we're going to have is going to be a relationship of respect, a relationship of friendship, that we will live side by side. And part of that is evidenced by the schools clause that's in the treaty. Every treaty in Western Canada signed after 1867 has a schools clause. The schools clause was inserted in the treaty at the request of the First Nation negotiators who said, We want schools built in our communities so that our children can be educated and participate in this new nation on a footing equal to the little white children who will be educated as well. The schools clause was very important to those negotiators on the Indigenous side because they wanted that education. But they didn't want residential schools. They didn't want their children taken away to be educated and indoctrinated into a different faith, into a different culture, to be punished for speaking their languages. That's not what they negotiated, but that's what the government saw they could do and did it. They didn't want an Indian Act, but that's what the government saw, and that's what the government did. The government was not interested in a friendship. Government was not interested in having that mutually respectful relationship. Sir John A. Macdonald was very clear that he saw this as a nation of white people, white European people, and eventually all of those Indians were going to have to become like white European people. In 1883, when he was asking Parliament to approve funding for building industrial schools in Western Canada, he said, if we don't take the children away from their parents, then they will become nothing more than savages who can read and write in those schools on their reserves. And they didn't want savages who could read and write. They didn't want Indian people to continue to have their own culture, their own protection, their own ways of doing things, their own inherent rights. That was not in his conversation. And that message permeated down all throughout the system. That's why it's important that the leadership of this government also make a message known so that it permeates down through the system as well. And we see that beginning now, but it has to be constantly made. It has to be made again and again and again. And people within government should be measured against the question of whether what they are doing is contributing to that nation-to-nation relationship and to that respectful relationship that our calls to action say is what reconciliation is all about. Reconciliation is about respect. We acknowledge that, and we've said that many times. And from the perspective of nations, it's about mutual respect. We are asking for governments to make statements and do things that will establish a nation-to-nation respectful relationship. But at the same time, we have pointed out the importance of ensuring that we put in place all of those things that are necessary for Indigenous people to develop self-respect. The schools have taken away our self-respect, but it's not just the residential schools that have done that. The public school system has done that too. All of us who have been educated in public schools in this country have been subjected to the same teachings about who the Indigenous people are and are not, and about what they should be. All public schools have taught the doctrine of discovery. All public schools have taught that Indigenous people are inferior, they're heathens, they're savages, they're not as good as the Europeans who came here. We were taught in the schools I went to, and probably you were too, that Indian peoples were just on the verge of disappearing. They were just about all to die off, and it's lucky that the government did what they did to save them from extinction. I remember that message very clearly, totally ignoring the fact that we had been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Thank you very much. And we didn't need white people to save us. But that's the message in the schools. And all of the Indigenous children who've been educated in the public schools of this country have suffered the same indignities, shaming, and lack of respect that the children in the residential schools experience as well. And they need to find a way to be able to regain that self-respect for themselves, because what it has created is a community of young Indigenous people who are very angry, who are still angry, and who are still dropping out, quitting schools when they can. We read a report not that long ago in which a survey of Indigenous children who have dropped out of schools was undertaken, and the question was asked, when did you decide to quit school? And most of the children, the highest percentage of children, had decided to quit school by the time they were 12 years old. 12 years of age. When you're 12 years old, you should be thinking about other things other than quitting school. But they're all deciding to quit school, and they do it at the first opportunity they can because the public schools are not giving them what they need. And it may be the First Nation schools are not giving them what they need too, because many First Nation schools, if not most, are using provincial school curriculums and provincial certified teachers who are required to be certified through faculties of education of this country. And what that means is that the teachers in the schools are not meeting their needs. Every young person needs to be able to answer 4 questions for themselves. And the first one is, where do I come from? That means, what is our history? What is my story? What is my history? And how do I fit into that history? Where do my people come from? What is the history of my people? Who are my heroes? What have my heroes done? They don't teach about Tecumseh in the schools in Eastern Canada, other than the fact that he died in the Battle of 1812, the War of 1812. They don't talk about the fact that he saved Canada's ass from the Americans. It's not a big thing that they teach. They still talk more about Brock than they do about Tecumseh. But they should be teaching about him not just as an Indigenous hero, but as a Canadian hero. And they're not. When I went to public school, it's changed a bit now, but when I went to public school, Louis Riel was a terrorist. They didn't call him that, called him a rebel. Right? It was the rebellion, the Red River Rebellion. It's like he was fighting against something that was inevitable. He was fighting against good. He was an evil man. They talked more about the hanging of Thomas Scott in the books that we studied about the Red River Resistance than they did about what it was that he was thinking about shaping the Métis Nation. So the treatment of Indigenous people in the public schools has contributed to our own sense of shaming as Indigenous people. And we need to understand that. And we need to ensure that our young Indigenous people are put into a place where they can feel pride in who they are, where they can regain their self-respect. And that's very important. That's why education is the key to reconciliation. Education at all levels is the key to reconciliation, because we not only have to change the way that we teach them in the public schools of this country, but we have to change the way that we prepare the teachers of them who will be teaching them so that they are prepared to give them that message. And many of them are not only not now prepared, but I can tell you from experience, because I've gotten the letters, many of them are outright antagonistic to having to teach something different because they see it as political indoctrination. So teachers have a ways to go yet, and we need to help them. We need to teach them the right way of doing things. But the other side of that public education that we need to understand is that the non-Indigenous children who went through that public school system also are carrying the mythology of white superiority, the mythology that European cultures and people were superior to the Indigenous peoples who are here. That's why it's so easy for them to think that this country is founded upon French and English nations, and that the Indigenous population was irrelevant to that. It's like coming into somebody's house and saying, "My, this is a nice house. We're going to declare this a French and English house, and never mind the fact that we took it away from the previous owners." It doesn't make any sense. You cannot declare a nation on land that you still don't have full title to. And yet they're doing that without recognizing that Indigenous people contributed more, perhaps, to the creation of this nation than the Europeans who came here. But that's not taught. I think it'll be a while before it is taught. But the reality is that those are the very questions that you have to struggle with in this conference, with the potential audience down the road that you have as you go back to your various institutions. In our calls to action, we have called upon your institutions to look at the way that you educate lawyers, to look at the way you educate social workers, to look at the way you educate teachers, to look at the way that you educate every single professional person in this country, to make sure that they understand what they are going to be undertaking in their profession when it comes to Indigenous people and their role in reconciliation. Because if you don't do it, they will continue to write letters to me. And I don't want any more letters. I have enough trouble with the letters I get from the Catholic Church. So I want to, again, thank you for letting me be part of this morning. I encourage you in everything that you're doing. I encourage you to make a commitment here today to continuing this dialogue and making it even bigger in scope than it is, and to do it on a regular basis, because you are the key to reconciliation. Education is the key to reconciliation at all levels. But because you have that influence over those who teach and those who define our country, those who define our nation, your role is all the more important. Remember that at the end of the day, academic institutions have an obligation to stand up for the rights of the people who are being ignored. Not just the legal profession, but academics. That's where liberty thoughts come from. That's where our sense of justice comes from, your study of it. The work that you do, the research that you do in your institutions will also contribute to the dialogue on reconciliation in significant ways. So I encourage you to make that happen as well. The change in the conversation is attributable, in my view, to the fact that young, Indigenous, academically capable leaders stood up during Idle No More and said, we're not going to take this anymore. Look at us. We are better than what you say we are. And you better get ready, they say, because we're coming at you. They are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Justice Sinclair. This brings the first portion of our conference to a close. I'd like to call on Feather Piuapskunias and the representatives of the Indigenous Students Council to come to the stage and give some gifts to our plenary speakers. But before we give the gifts, I just wanted to, I was reminded by a survivor, residential school survivor, to share these words with you. So these are not my words, these are my friend Eugene Arcan's words. Murray referred to him as Big Bird, and he's a pretty big guy, he's in the corner. But Eugene wanted me to share with you that the calls to action are not a call, reiterating what Murray just said, we're not a call to action to the government, this particular government or any future particular government. It's a call to Canadians. It's a call to Canadians to stand up and move towards reconciliation every day, and that this is what the TRC is about from his perspective, and he wanted me to share that. I think I captured your words, Eugene, properly, maybe not as eloquently, but thank you for that. So I'd like to call up the Indigenous Students Council, and I'd like to call up Robert, Bobby Cameron, Jackson, and Jack Saddleback, and National Chief Bellegarde to receive some gifts, some tokens of our appreciation. And the students, I think the students, come over here, feather. Coming up. I think they have. So on behalf of the University of Saskatchewan, Murray, thank you very much. We extend this small gift. Thank you for traveling to visit us. Yes, please. While the gifts are being provided, I'd let the plenary speakers know and the media immediately following this, we'll have a press conference in the executor room, or Exeter room, I think it's called. And this brings my participation to a close. Again, I want to just thank you so much for coming to Saskatoon on good Canadian weather, on a good fall day, and for traveling here, and look forward to meeting many of you over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.